The emergency began at 37,000 feet above the Pacific, when Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the cabin intercom with words that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency in the cockpit. If there is anyone on board with flight experience, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately." In seat 12A, Vera Ghost Nakamura didn't look up from her phone. She was texting her daughter about missing another soccer game, her thumbs moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. Around her, passengers exchanged nervous glances, their vacation chatter dissolving into whispered concerns. The Boeing 777-300ER shuddered slightly through turbulence, its twin General Electric GE90 engines maintaining their steady drone against the afternoon sky. Ghost had heard those words before, in different contexts, different aircraft. But this was supposed to be her civilian life now. No call signs, no tactical radio chatter, no responsibility for anyone's life but her own. She was just another passenger heading home to San Diego, wearing jeans and a faded University of California sweatshirt, her military short black hair hidden beneath a baseball cap. Nothing about her suggested she'd spent 12 years flying everything from FA-18 Super Hornets to KC-135 Stratotankers. The flight attendant, a nervous young man with trembling hands, moved down the aisle repeating the captain's request. Most passengers avoided eye contact. Ghost noticed the subtle signs of panic beginning to ripple through the cabin, the way conversations dropped to whispers, how people clutched their armrests a little tighter, the forced smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes. Her phone buzzed with another message from Kayla. "Mom, when are you getting home? I scored 2 goals today." Ghost smiled despite everything, typing back quickly. Her daughter didn't need to know that her mother's business trip had actually been a veteran support group meeting in Seattle, another attempt to find her place in a world without wings and weapon systems. The flight attendant reached row 12. His name tag read Bradley, and his face had gone pale beneath his professional smile. "Excuse me, ma'am, did you hear the captain's announcement? Do you happen to have any flight experience?" Ghost looked up from her phone, meeting his eyes for the first time. She could see her own reflection in his pupils, just another middle-aged woman in civilian clothes. What Bradley couldn't see was the 8,000 flight hours logged across 3 combat deployments, or the Distinguished Flying Cross gathering dust in a storage unit back home. He couldn't see the nights she'd brought damaged aircraft home when everyone else had written off the mission. "Define flight experience," Ghost said quietly, her voice carrying a subtle edge that made Bradley pause. Something in her tone suggested this conversation was about to become very different from what anyone expected. The first domino had fallen. High above the Pacific, with 243 souls on board, Ghost Nakamura was about to discover that some skills never really fade. They just wait for the moment when the sky calls you home. The cockpit door remained sealed, but Ghost could hear the urgency in the crew's radio transmissions bleeding through the aircraft's communication system. Captain Morrison's voice had grown strained over the intercom, professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. First Officer Reynolds wasn't responding to radio calls. The medical emergency wasn't just an emergency anymore. It was becoming a crisis. Bradley, the flight attendant, stood frozen in the aisle, clearly unprepared for Ghost's response. "I mean, like, any kind of pilot training, small planes, maybe commercial experience." His voice carried the desperate hope of someone grasping for solutions in a situation spiraling beyond his training manual. Ghost saved her text message and slipped the phone into her pocket. Around them, passengers were starting to notice the conversation, their attention drawn by Bradley's obvious distress and Ghost's unexpectedly calm demeanor. She could feel their stares, the way fear made people hyper-aware of every detail that might offer salvation or signal doom. "I've got some experience," Ghost said, unbuckling her seatbelt with movements that were too smooth, too practiced for civilian flying. But you need to understand what you're asking. The aircraft's autopilot was holding course, but Ghost could feel subtle variations in the flight path that civilian passengers wouldn't notice. The slight banking corrections, the minor altitude adjustments, signs that whoever was still conscious in the cockpit was struggling to maintain control. Her trained ear picked up the almost imperceptible changes in engine harmonics that suggested someone was making small power adjustments manually. Bradley keyed his radio with shaking hands. "Captain Morrison, I have a passenger in 12A who says she has flight experience." The response came immediately. "Bring her forward now." As Ghost stood, she noticed the woman across the aisle watching her with sharp intelligence. Dr. Elena Vasquez, according to the luggage tag on her carry-on bag, was clearly someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. Their eyes met for a moment, and Ghost saw recognition there, not of her identity but of her type. Military bearing was hard to completely disguise, even in civilian clothes. "You're not just some weekend pilot, are you?" Dr. Vasquez asked quietly as Ghost stepped into the aisle. Ghost paused. "Does it matter?" "To everyone on this plane, yes." The honesty was refreshing. Ghost nodded. 12 years Navy, multiple aircraft types, but I haven't flown commercial and it's been 2 years since I was in a cockpit. Dr. Vasquez's expression shifted from concern to something approaching relief. 2 years isn't forever. Muscle memory doesn't disappear overnight. As Bradley led her toward the front of the aircraft, Ghost caught fragments of whispered conversations around her. Someone mentioned prayer. Another passenger was quietly crying. A businessman in first class was frantically typing on his laptop, probably sending what he thought might be final messages to his family. The weight of responsibility settled on Ghost's shoulders like a familiar flight suit. She'd carried this burden before, the knowledge that other people's lives depended entirely on her skill, judgment, and ability to perform under pressure when everything went wrong. But those had been combat situations, with trained crews and military aircraft she knew intimately. This was different. This was a civilian airliner full of families, vacation travelers, business people who'd never signed up for anything more dangerous than airline coffee. They deserved better than a washed-up former Navy pilot whose last performance review had recommended early retirement for failure to adapt to peacetime service requirements. Ghost pushed the doubt aside. Self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford at 37,000 feet. The cockpit door swung open to reveal Captain Morrison hunched over the center console, his uniform shirt soaked with sweat despite the controlled cabin temperature. First Officer Reynolds slumped unconscious in the right seat, his breathing shallow and labored. The Boeing 777's flight deck looked like organized chaos. Warning lights painted the instrument panels in amber and red, and Morrison's hands moved constantly between controls, trying to manage systems that were demanding more attention than one person could provide. "Thank God," Morrison said without looking up. "Tell me you know something about commercial aviation." Ghost stepped into the cockpit, her eyes automatically scanning the primary flight display, navigation screens, and engine parameters. The numbers told a story she didn't like. They were burning fuel faster than optimal. The autopilot was making constant corrections for turbulence, and several non-critical systems were showing caution indicators. "I'm Navy. Fighters and tankers mostly, but I understand the basics." Morrison finally looked at her, and Ghost saw a man operating on pure adrenaline and professional training. He was maybe 55, probably had 30 years of commercial flying experience, but nothing in his background had prepared him for single-pilot operations of a wide-body aircraft with a medical emergency at cruise altitude over the Pacific Ocean. "Navy," he repeated, and something in his voice suggested that was better than he'd hoped for. "Call sign." "Ghost." Morrison's hands never stopped moving as he adjusted the aircraft's heading slightly. "Ghost, I need to get Reynolds to the cabin so the medical personnel can work on him. But I can't leave the cockpit unattended, and I can't fly this bird alone much longer. My question is simple. Can you help me get us on the ground safely?" Ghost looked at the instrument panel again. The Boeing 777 was as different from an FA-18 as a sports car was from an aircraft carrier, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Lift, thrust, drag, weight. Navigation, communication, systems management. The physics hadn't changed, even if the application was radically different. "I can try," she said. "That's not good enough." Morrison's voice carried the weight of command, the tone of someone who needed absolute certainty in a situation where uncertainty could kill everyone. "I need to know if you can do this, really do this, because if we start this process and you can't handle it, we don't have backup options." Ghost understood what he was asking. She looked out the cockpit windows at the endless expanse of Pacific Ocean below, then back at the unconscious first officer, then at Morrison's exhausted face. 243 people were depending on a conversation between strangers that would determine whether they lived or died. "Captain, I've landed damaged aircraft on carrier decks in 30-foot seas during combat operations. I've brought home planes that shouldn't have been able to fly. But I've never flown a 777, and I don't know your emergency procedures." Morrison actually smiled for the first time. "Ghost, the day I can't teach a Navy pilot how to land a plane is the day I turn in my wings. Welcome to United Flight 1247. Let's get to work." The partnership was born out of necessity, but Ghost could already feel the familiar rhythm of crew coordination beginning to establish itself. High above the Pacific, with hundreds of lives in the balance, two pilots were about to discover what they could accomplish together. Morrison moved with practiced efficiency as he briefed Ghost on the 777 systems. His hands gestured toward displays and controls, while his voice maintained the clipped, professional tone of a Czech pilot running through emergency procedures. But Ghost could hear the underlying strain, the way exhaustion was beginning to fray the edges of his composure. "Primary flight display gives you attitude, altitude, airspeed, vertical speed," Morrison said, pointing to the screens in front of the captain's seat. "Navigation display shows your flight path, weather, traffic. Engine parameters are here on the EICAS engine indicating and crew alerting system. The aircraft will basically fly itself as long as the autopilot stays engaged, but landing requires manual control." Ghost absorbed the information quickly, her mind automatically categorizing and prioritizing the data stream. The 777's cockpit was significantly more automated than anything she'd flown, with computer systems managing most routine operations. In some ways, that made things easier. In others, it created new points of potential failure that she didn't fully understand. "What's our fuel status?" she asked, settling into the left seat as Morrison prepared to move the unconscious first officer. "About 6 hours at current consumption. We're 4 hours out from Los Angeles, but that assumes everything goes normally." Morrison checked Reynolds's pulse and breathing. "I've already declared an emergency and requested vectors to the nearest suitable airport. That's either LAX or San Diego, depending on conditions." Ghost's heart jumped at the mention of San Diego. Kayla would be at soccer practice right now, probably wondering why her mother hadn't responded to her latest text messages. The thought of her daughter provided both motivation and distraction. She needed to focus, but the stakes had suddenly become intensely personal. "Medical situation?" Ghost asked, helping Morrison lift the unconscious first officer from his seat. "Massive heart attack, best guess. He was complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath, then just collapsed." Morrison's voice carried the weight of someone who'd lost friends before. "Dr. Vasquez from 12B is a cardiologist. She's got him stable for now, but he needs a hospital." They maneuvered Reynolds through the cockpit door, where Dr. Vasquez and two flight attendants were waiting with medical supplies. Ghost caught the doctor's eye as they transferred the patient. "How long?" Ghost asked quietly. "He's stable but critical. Maybe 4 hours before we start losing him." Dr. Vasquez's professional assessment carried no false comfort. "Can you get us down?" Ghost didn't answer immediately. She was still learning the aircraft's systems, still adapting to instruments and procedures that were foreign to her muscle memory. But Dr. Vasquez deserved honesty, even if it wasn't reassuring. "We're going to try," Ghost said. Back in the cockpit, Morrison was already running through emergency checklists. The aircraft felt different now, more alive under Ghost's hands as she familiarized herself with the controls. The autopilot was maintaining course and altitude, but she could feel the subtle corrections it was making for turbulence and wind shifts. "Los Angeles Center, United 1247, Morrison transmitted on the radio. "We have a medical emergency in the cockpit and are operating with a substitute pilot, requesting priority handling and emergency equipment standing by." The response came immediately. "United 1247, Los Angeles Center, roger your emergency. You are cleared direct to Los Angeles International Airport, descend and maintain flight level 300. Emergency equipment will be standing by. What is the nature of your pilot substitution?" Morrison looked at Ghost, raising an eyebrow. "How did you explain that your replacement pilot was a combat veteran who'd never flown a commercial airliner?" Ghost keyed the microphone herself. "Los Angeles Center, United 1247. Substitute pilot is military trained with extensive flight experience but unfamiliar with this aircraft type. We will require vectors and assistance for approach and landing." A long pause followed. Then, "United 1247, roger. We'll have our best controller handle your approach. You are not alone up there." The descent began smoothly, with Ghost's hands light on the controls as the autopilot reduced power and began the long glide toward Los Angeles. At 30,000 feet, the Pacific Ocean spread endlessly below them, its surface catching the afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Today, it represented 4 miles of empty air between the aircraft and an unforgiving surface. Morrison worked through the approach checklists with methodical precision, his fingers dancing across switches and displays as he configured the aircraft for landing. Ghost watched his every movement, memorizing procedures she'd need to execute herself once they reached the critical phases of flight. The 777 responded differently than the military aircraft she was accustomed to, more stable but less agile, like comparing a cruise ship to a speedboat. "Landing weight will be about 480,000 pounds, Morrison said, checking fuel calculations on the flight management computer. "That's well within limits, but it means we'll need more runway than usual, and the aircraft will float more during touchdown." Ghost nodded, filing the information away with dozens of other details that might prove critical in the next hour. She was beginning to understand the 777's personality, the way it wanted to be flown, the rhythms of its systems, the subtle cues it provided through the controls. Every aircraft had its own character, and she was getting acquainted with this one under circumstances that left no room for gradual familiarization. "United 1247, Los Angeles Center, begin descent to flight level 240. The controller's voice carried professional calm, but Ghost could hear the heightened attention that came with handling an emergency flight. Every word was precise, every instruction confirmed twice. "United 1247, leaving flight level 300 for flight level 240, Morrison responded, then looked at Ghost. "Your aircraft, take us down." Ghost's hands found the controls with movements that felt both foreign and familiar. The 777's yoke was different from the stick controls she was used to, but the principles remained constant. She disengaged the autopilot's altitude hold and began a smooth descent, watching the vertical speed indicator as the aircraft settled into a controlled dive. The sensation was strange, piloting an aircraft filled with people who had no idea their lives depended on a conversation she'd never expected to have. Behind her, Dr. Vasquez was working to keep First Officer Reynolds stable. In the cabin, flight attendants were quietly preparing passengers for what might be a difficult landing. Everyone was playing their part in a drama that had begun with a simple medical emergency and escalated into something much more complex. "Descent rate looks good," Morrison said, monitoring her technique. "Remember, this bird has more momentum than what you're used to. Everything happens more slowly, but the consequences of mistakes are bigger." Ghost appreciated the guidance without feeling patronized. Morrison was treating her like a professional pilot who needed technical information, not like a novice who required hand-holding. The distinction mattered more than she would have expected. United 1247, contact Los Angeles approach on 121.9, came the next transmission. Los Angeles approach. United 1247 with you, level 240, emergency aircraft with substitute pilot. Morrison transmitted on the new frequency. United 1247, Los Angeles approach, radar contact. We have you 30 miles southwest of the airport. Expect vectors for the ILS approach to runway 25 left. The weather is clear, winds light and variable. Emergency equipment is standing by. Ghost felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Clear weather meant visual references during the approach. Light winds meant fewer variables to manage during the critical landing phase. For once, conditions were working in their favor rather than against them. "How many approaches have you made in combat?" Morrison asked. "Hundreds, but most of them were on carriers or short tactical runways." Ghost's answer carried both confidence and humility. "Lax is going to be different." Morrison smiled grimly. "Ghost, if you can put a fighter on a carrier deck, you can land a 777 on a 12,000-foot runway. Trust me." 20 miles from Los Angeles International Airport, Ghost began to feel the weight of what she was attempting. The 777 was no longer just an aircraft. It had become a responsibility that encompassed every soul on board. Each passenger represented someone's family, someone's future, someone's reason for coming home safely. The abstract concept of lives in the balance had crystallized into faces she'd seen walking through the cabin, voices she'd heard during the flight, stories she could only imagine. United 1247, turn left heading 090, descend and maintain 6,000 feet, Los Angeles approach transmitted. "You're being vectored for the ILS 25 left approach. Advise when you have the airport in sight." Morrison acknowledged the transmission while Ghost executed the turn, feeling the massive aircraft bank smoothly to the left. Below them, the Los Angeles basin spread out like a circuit board, its grid of streets and highways pulsing with late afternoon traffic. Somewhere down there, people were finishing their workdays, picking up children from school, planning dinner, all unaware that a drama was unfolding in the sky above them. "Airport in sight," Ghost called out, spotting the familiar pattern of runways and terminal buildings that marked LAX. From this altitude and distance, it looked impossibly small, like trying to thread a needle while wearing gloves. She'd made approaches to aircraft carriers that seemed larger and more welcoming than the runway that was about to become her target. United 1247, traffic in sight, turn right heading 120, descend and maintain 3,000 feet, the controller transmitted. "You're number one for the approach. All other traffic is being held or diverted." The significance of that statement wasn't lost on Ghost. Los Angeles International Airport was one of the busiest airports in the world, handling hundreds of flights every hour. The fact that controllers were clearing all other traffic meant they understood the stakes involved in her approach. She was getting priority handling that commercial pilots might experience once in an entire career. "Configure the aircraft for approach," Morrison said, beginning to work through the landing checklist. "Flaps 15 degrees, landing gear down before landing checklist." Ghost moved her hands to unfamiliar controls, extending the wing flaps and lowering the landing gear while Morrison monitored her actions. The aircraft's configuration changed dramatically as the flaps deployed, creating more lift and drag while transforming the 777's flight characteristics. She could feel the airplane wanting to slow down, requiring more power to maintain approach speed. Flaps 30 before landing checklist complete, Morrison announced. Approach speed is 140 knots. You'll want to cross the runway threshold at about 130. The numbers were different from military aviation, where approach speeds were often much higher and landing rollouts much shorter. But the fundamental challenge remained the same: manage energy, maintain control, touch down smoothly in the right place at the right speed. Physics didn't care whether you were landing on a carrier deck or a commercial runway. United 1247, contact the tower on 120.95, approach control transmitted. Good luck up there. The controller's final comment broke protocol slightly, revealing the human concern behind the professional facade. Ghost appreciated the sentiment, even as she focused on the expanding runway ahead of them. Tower, United 1247 on final approach, runway 25 left, Morrison transmitted on the new frequency. United 1247, Tower, cleared to land runway 25 left. Wind calm, emergency equipment is in position. Ghost could see the fire trucks and ambulances lined up alongside the runway, their red and white vehicles looking like toys from 3,000 feet. Soon, she would find out whether their services would be needed for a routine medical emergency or something much worse. The 777 was fully configured now, stable in its approach configuration with all systems operating normally. But Ghost knew that the next few minutes would determine whether her 12 years of military aviation training could translate into saving the lives of 243 civilians who had never asked for this level of excitement in their travel plans. At 2 miles from the runway, Ghost could see individual markings on the pavement. The numbers, 25L, painted in massive white letters, the touchdown zone markers that would guide her to the proper landing point, the precision approach path indicators showing red and white lights that confirmed she was on the correct glide path. The Boeing 777 felt solid and controllable in her hands, responding predictably to her inputs as she made small corrections for wind and alignment. Airspeed 145 knots, on glide path, on centerline, Morrison called out, providing the verbal confirmations that were standard for commercial aviation. His voice had settled into the rhythm of a professional pilot managing a normal approach, but Ghost could hear the underlying tension that came with knowing how much was riding on the next few minutes. The runway was growing larger in the windscreen, no longer an abstract target but a concrete reality rushing toward them at over 2 miles per minute. Ghost had made this calculation hundreds of times in her military career, but never in an aircraft this size, never with civilian passengers, never with stakes that felt quite so personal. Somewhere behind her, Dr. Vasquez was keeping First Officer Reynolds alive, buying precious time for a successful landing and emergency medical care. United 1247, you are cleared to land, runway 25 left. Emergency equipment is standing by, the tower controller transmitted, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who understood that they were all witnesses to something that could go very right or very wrong in the next 60 seconds. 1 mile from touchdown, airspeed 142, Morrison announced. Looking good, Ghost, just like any other approach. But it wasn't like any other approach, and they both knew it. Ghost's military experience had prepared her for high-stress landings, but those had been in aircraft she knew intimately, with co-pilots who shared her training and background. This was improvisation at the highest level, with lives hanging in the balance and no second chances if she misjudged the approach. The runway threshold passed beneath them at exactly the right height and speed. Ghost began the landing flare, pulling back gently on the yoke to arrest their descent, and set up for touchdown. The 777 responded smoothly, its nose coming up as the main gear approached the runway. She could feel the aircraft wanting to float in ground effect, the cushion of air compressed between the wings and the runway surface. Airspeed 138, rate of descent 500 feet per minute, Morrison called out. Looking perfect. Ghost held the flare, waiting for the main gear to contact the runway while managing the aircraft's energy. Too much airspeed and they would float past the touchdown zone. Too little and they would drop hard onto the pavement. The balance required precise judgment developed through thousands of practice approaches, muscle memory refined by experience and training. The main landing gear touched the runway with a gentle chirp of tires on concrete, exactly in the touchdown zone. Ghost immediately lowered the nose wheel to the pavement and began applying wheel brakes and reverse thrust, feeling the massive aircraft's momentum gradually overcome by friction and aerodynamic drag. The 777 tracked straight down the center line as their speed decreased from approach velocity to taxi speed. Nicely done, Morrison said quietly, and Ghost heard genuine admiration in his voice. That was a textbook landing. Ghost felt a wave of relief wash over her as they turned off the runway onto a taxiway, where emergency vehicles were already positioning to escort them to the gate. The approach and landing had gone exactly as planned, but she knew that success in aviation often came down to preparation meeting opportunity, training meeting challenge, and sometimes just plain luck. United 1247, contact ground control on 121.65. Welcome to Los Angeles, the tower controller transmitted, and Ghost could hear the smile in his voice. The emergency was over, but Ghost was beginning to understand that something else was just beginning. Ground control guided them to a gate where emergency medical personnel were already waiting. Ghost watched through the cockpit windows as paramedics rushed toward the aircraft with equipment she recognized from her own military medical training: defibrillators, oxygen tanks, stretchers, and the controlled urgency of professionals who specialized in saving lives when time was measured in minutes. Dr. Vasquez appeared in the cockpit doorway as Morrison shut down the engines. He's still stable, but we need to get him to a cardiac unit immediately, she reported. You got us down in time. The simple statement carried weight that Ghost was still processing. First Officer Reynolds would live because she had successfully landed an aircraft she'd never flown before, using procedures she'd learned minutes earlier, in a situation that had required every bit of her military training, and then some. The responsibility she'd felt during the approach was transforming into something else, a quiet satisfaction that came from professional competence applied when it mattered most. How did it feel? Morrison asked as they completed the post-flight shutdown checklist. Flying a 777. Ghost considered the question carefully. Heavier than what I'm used to, more stable, more forgiving in some ways, less responsive in others. She paused, looking out at the ground crews and emergency vehicles surrounding their aircraft. Different, but not impossibly different. Morrison nodded. You've got good instincts, natural feel for the aircraft. If you ever want to transition to commercial aviation, I'd be happy to provide a recommendation. The suggestion caught Ghost off guard. For 2 years, she'd been struggling to find her place in civilian life, bouncing between jobs that felt meaningless compared to her military service. The idea of returning to aviation, even in a commercial context, hadn't occurred to her as a realistic possibility. I appreciate that, she said, but I'm probably too old to start over as a commercial pilot. Age is just a number, Morrison replied. Experience and judgment are what matter when things go wrong. Today proved you've got both. Passengers were beginning to deplane, many of them stopping to look into the cockpit as they passed. Ghost saw a range of emotions on their faces: relief, gratitude, curiosity about the woman who had helped bring them home safely. A few people nodded or offered quiet words of thanks. One businessman shook her hand and said simply, Thank you for getting us down." The gesture was small but significant. For 12 years, Ghost's job had been protecting people who often never knew they needed protection. Today, for the first time, she could see the direct result of her skills and training in the faces of people whose lives had been affected by her performance. United 1247 crew, please report to the chief pilot's office when you're ready, came a voice over the aircraft's intercom system. And ma'am, if you're the substitute pilot, we'd like to speak with you as well. Ghost looked at Morrison, who shrugged. Standard procedure after an emergency. They'll want to debrief the entire situation, get your account of what happened, probably discuss your performance. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the cockpit, Ghost realized that her anonymous travel day had ended the moment Captain Morrison asked if anyone could land the plane. Whatever came next, she was no longer just another passenger on United Flight 1247. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Kayla. "Mom, are you okay? I saw on the news that your flight had some kind of emergency. Please call me." Ghost smiled as she typed back. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just helped out with a small problem. I'll call you in a few minutes and tell you all about it." Some stories, she realized, were worth missing soccer practice to tell. The chief pilot's office at Los Angeles International Airport felt more like a military briefing room than a corporate conference space. Charts covered the walls, radio frequencies were written on whiteboards, and the furniture was functional rather than decorative. Ghost sat across from Captain Sarah Chen, United Airlines chief pilot for the West Coast region, while Morrison occupied a chair beside her. "I've been flying for 32 years, Captain Chen began, reviewing a tablet that presumably contained the preliminary incident report. "I've dealt with medical emergencies, mechanical failures, weather emergencies, and just about everything else you can imagine, but I've never seen anything quite like this." Ghost waited. In her military experience, initial debriefings were about gathering facts, not making judgments. She'd learned to listen more than she spoke, especially when dealing with superior officers who were still forming their opinions about unusual situations. "According to the flight data recorder, your approach and landing were textbook perfect," Chen continued. "Airspeed control, glide path management, touchdown point, rollout, everything exactly where it should be. That's remarkable for someone who had never flown a 777 before today." Morrison leaned forward. "She's got excellent instincts and 12 years of military aviation experience. Once I explained the aircraft systems, she adapted very quickly." 12 years Navy, Ghost added. "Multiple aircraft types, including some challenging carrier operations. But Captain Morrison is being generous. He did most of the work. I was just following his instructions." Chen made a note on her tablet. "That's not what the cockpit voice recorder indicates. The final approach was entirely under your control, with Morrison providing systems management and communication support. That's called crew resource management, and you both executed it perfectly." The conversation was taking a direction Ghost hadn't expected. She'd assumed the debrief would focus on the irregularities of the situation: an unqualified pilot in the left seat, emergency procedures that weren't in any manual, potential liability issues that might concern the airline's legal department. Instead, Chen seemed genuinely interested in her performance and experience. "What are your current employment plans?" Chen asked. Ghost hesitated. The question felt like it might be leading somewhere she wasn't prepared to go. "I'm between jobs at the moment, trying to figure out what comes next after military service." "Have you considered commercial aviation?" "Not really. I assumed I was too old to start over, and I don't have the civilian certifications." Chen smiled. "Age requirements for airline pilots have been extended to 65, and your military experience transfers directly to civilian certifications with the right training program. More importantly, what you demonstrated today, judgment under pressure, crew coordination, the ability to adapt quickly to new situations. Those are exactly the qualities we look for in pilots. Ghost felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced since leaving the Navy. It wasn't quite hope, but it was closer to optimism than anything she'd felt in 2 years of civilian job hunting. "Are you offering me something?" she asked directly. "I'm suggesting we continue this conversation," Chen replied. "United has a military transition program for experienced pilots who want to move into commercial aviation. The training is intensive, but it's designed specifically for people with backgrounds like yours." Morrison nodded enthusiastically. "I'd be happy to mentor you through the process. Today proved you've got what it takes." Ghost thought about her daughter's soccer games, the apartment in San Diego that felt more like a temporary stopping point than a home, the sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since leaving the Navy. The possibility that flying could be part of her future again hadn't occurred to her as realistic until this moment. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Take all the time you need," Chen said, handing her a business card. "But Ghost, can I call you Ghost? What you did today reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place. We need people like you." Outside Lax's administrative building, Ghost found Dr. Vasquez waiting beside a rental car, her medical bag slung over one shoulder. The cardiologist looked tired but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd spent the day saving lives and succeeded. "How's First Officer Reynolds?" Ghost asked. "Stable and responding well to treatment," Dr. Vasquez replied. "The cardiac team at UCLA Medical Center says he'll make a full recovery. Getting him to the hospital when we did probably saved his life." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching aircraft take off and land on the parallel runways. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Ghost why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. There was something about being above the earth, seeing the world from a perspective that few people ever experienced, that made the complications of ground-based life seem manageable. "Are you really thinking about becoming a commercial pilot?" Dr. Vasquez asked. Ghost was surprised by the question. "How did you know they offered me that?" "I didn't, but I saw the way you handled the cockpit, the way Morrison treated you as an equal, the way you looked when you were flying. You belonged up there." The observation was more perceptive than Ghost had expected from someone she'd known for less than 6 hours. "I'm not sure I'm ready to start over again. New career, new training, new everything." Dr. Vasquez smiled. "I transitioned from emergency medicine to cardiology when I was 42. Everyone said I was too old, too set in my ways, that I'd never adapt to the different pace and procedures. But you know what I discovered?" "What?" "Experience doesn't make you inflexible, it makes you adaptable. You've already proven you can learn new systems quickly, work with unfamiliar crews, perform under pressure. Those skills transfer to any aviation environment." A United Airlines 777, similar to the one they'd just landed, taxied past them toward a departure gate.